Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where growing up wasn't awkward, it was downright brutal. Imagine a life where every sunrise meant freezing stone floors under your feet, meals that barely qualified as food, and adults judging you like your entire existence was a crime. No room for mistakes, no privacy, no mercy. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and current local time in the comments, because someone out there is living through this madness right now. Now, settle in and get comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Teenagers in medieval Europe had a front row seat to a life that was equal parts exhausting and absurd, like nature decided to throw a puberty-themed obstacle course without any safety nets. Their mornings were marked by the screech of roosters, the pungent smell of animal waste wafting from narrow streets, and parents who operated under the philosophy that sleep was a luxury for the weak. Bedrooms were cold stone corners that could double as morgues during winter, and drafts seemed to have personal vendettas against growing bones. Education was mostly a rich kid's flex, so the majority of teens spent their days under the thumb of family, guilds, or whoever claimed authority that day, learning early that the world had zero patience for whining. Boys were shoved into apprenticeships that demanded strength they didn't have, wielding hammers and saws like survival depended on it, because, spoiler alert, it did. Girls, meanwhile, were groomed like rare livestock for marriage, often entering the world of adults while still trying to figure out how to walk without tripping over themselves. Freedom of choice was a concept so distant it might as well have been a myth whispered by traveling bards. Gossip was the neighborhood sport, church sermons doubled as psychological warfare, and the moral policing of every sneeze, cough, or glance made social life feel like walking a tightrope over boiling oil. The streets were mud-soaked gauntlets populated by livestock, carts, and the occasional drunk noble who seemed to think teenagers were targets for unsolicited life advice. Illness was practically guaranteed, and medicine was mostly guesswork with herbs, which often made teenagers feel like unwilling participants in a sadistic experiment. Social mobility was a joke, so your family's reputation could either crown you as a prodigy or condemn you to a life of back-breaking labor. Diets consisted of bread that could chip a tooth, watery soups, and seasonal vegetables that sometimes came with a side of dysentery. Leisure existed only as stolen moments between chores or dodging someone's wrath, and even those brief respites were punctuated by the awareness that the slightest misstep could ruin your day or your life. Physical growth, mood swings, and the chaotic mess of adolescence were magnified by relentless labor, disease, and social scrutiny, making survival an achievement in itself. It was a world where the line between childhood and adulthood blurred violently, and teenagers navigated it with a combination of grit, luck, and an absurdly high pain tolerance. And yet somehow they endured, trudging through muddy streets and drafty halls, collecting scars and stories that would haunt them, or at least make for some grim dinner table anecdotes later. As the sun climbed higher, teenagers' lives were defined less by choice and more by relentless obligations that would make even the most patient person snap. And yes, the concept of weekends was a fantasy reserved for saints or fictional peasants in some bard song. Boys spent hours hauling heavy sacks, tending animals, or learning trades under masters who treated mistakes like criminal offenses, while girls were swept into endless domestic chores that seemed designed to test endurance and sanity simultaneously. Their hands often bore the calluses of labor before their minds had fully grasped what it meant to be responsible for survival, and skin scars told stories nobody asked to hear, but everybody noticed anyway. Social hierarchy was a permanent shadow. Nobles could wield power like a weapon, and townsfolk whispered that reputation could literally save or destroy a life, which made teenagers hyper-aware of every awkward word or gesture, because apparently spilling milk or mispronouncing a name was a mortal offense if the wrong person saw it. Weather was a constant enemy. Rain turned streets into mud traps, snow became a frozen prison, and summer brought swarms of insects that treated human flesh like an all-inclusive buffet. Illness lurked behind every cough or rash, often striking the young with alarming speed, and remedies were as random as they were painful. Leeching, poultices, and dubious herbal concoctions often caused more damage than the sickness itself. The ever-present threat of violence, bandits on the roads, quarrels between villagers, or disputes with neighbors, meant teenagers walked a fine line between surviving the mundane and surviving the extraordinary, all while being expected to behave like miniature adults. Education, where it existed, came with a side of humiliation. Latin lessons, memorization of prayers, and rigid moral instruction left little room for imagination. So teenagers learned early that making a mistake in public was a performance of shame everyone remembered forever. Even play, when allowed, was rough, dirty, and occasionally deadly. Kids wielded sticks like swords, and accidents were shrugged off as part of growing up, which in hindsight was just a medieval way of saying, "Hope you survive this one." Families often imposed marriage plans or apprenticeships with zero input, meaning a teenager's entire future could be negotiated over like livestock while they still had awkward voices and limbs that didn't fit anywhere. And as much as teenagers dreamed of freedom, the crushing monotony of labor, social expectation, and constant threat of illness created a daily tension that made every fleeting moment of joy feel like a dangerous rebellion. Amid all this, the world was a relentless teacher of humility and despair, and teenagers navigated it with a mixture of ingenuity, exhaustion, and the occasional sarcastic internal commentary, because if you didn't make fun of how absurdly unfair life was, it would have eaten you alive. Ultimately, the medieval teenage experience was a delicate juggling act between survival, obedience, and self-preservation, where every day tested not just their strength, but their patience, wit, and ability to grin through relentless misery. Teenagers in medieval Europe quickly learned that surviving labor and disease was only half the battle. Navigating social dynamics was a whole other arena, and one where a single misstep could haunt you longer than any scar. Villages were tight-knit enough that gossip spread faster than a fire in a straw barn, and teenagers had no privacy, no personal space, and zero chance to mess up without someone recording it in the mental archives of the entire town. Friends were scarce, and loyalty was fragile, often dictated by who had the largest family, the fastest horse, or the shiniest shoes. Though let's be real, shiny shoes were usually reserved for adults who had already stolen your dignity once that morning. Schooling, if it happened at all, doubled as public humiliation. Mispronouncing a Latin word in front of a priest could earn a lecture, a slap, and the lingering glare of peers who delighted in every mistake, which made every attempt at learning feel like voluntary torture. Festivals and religious ceremonies offered tiny breaks, but they were just new stages for embarrassment. Boys tripping while carrying ceremonial candles, girls fumbling their awkwardly fastened gowns, and elders scowling like judges at a trial they were too lazy to care about properly. Courtship, when teenagers even dared think about it, was basically a minefield. Any romantic gesture could be misconstrued, mocked, or outright forbidden, and rumors spread like wildfire, branding you forever with the kind of nickname that would make future generations snicker and your own parents sigh in disappointment. Authority figures, parents, masters, priests, and the occasional local lord watched every move, ready to intervene at the first sign of independence, because apparently a teenager having an opinion was a dangerous act of rebellion. Even casual banter among peers required strategy, because one poorly timed joke could spiral into a week of social ostracism, public embarrassment, or, if you were particularly unlucky, a physical reprimand. Economic status dictated popularity and opportunity, so wealthier families' teens enjoyed slightly softer scrutiny, while those from modest households were scrutinized mercilessly, judged for clothing, manners, and even facial expressions, as if they'd somehow volunteered for medieval reality TV. Hierarchies were layered and confusing. Younger siblings, older siblings, cousins, apprentices, neighbors, and visiting nobles all had subtle yet brutal power over a teenager's social standing, creating a constant tension where survival wasn't just physical, but psychological. The street, which doubled as a playground, marketplace, and execution stage for social mistakes, demanded constant vigilance. Sneezing too loudly, stepping on the wrong cobblestone, or laughing at the wrong joke could brand you a troublemaker in eyes that rarely showed mercy. Peer pressure wasn't some abstract modern concept. It was a daily, grinding force that shaped decisions, behavior, and even future prospects, leaving teenagers hyper-aware of how every glance, word, and gesture might be interpreted. In essence, adolescence was less about rebellion and identity, and more about tiptoeing through a minefield of social expectations, gossip, and public shaming, with no pause, no undo button, and absolutely zero context for why life had to be so unreasonably dramatic. The constant balancing act between not getting sick, not getting hurt, and not being socially obliterated made teenage life an exhausting performance. And somehow they had to do it all while growing bodies and hormones were plotting their own chaotic rebellion behind the scenes. Family expectations in medieval Europe were less like guidance and more like a relentless personal trainer who hated teenagers specifically, except instead of giving you a whistle, they gave you chores, life plans, and constant judgment for breathing wrong. Boys were expected to master trades, swordsmanship, or farm labor as if their growing bodies weren't already busy rebelling in unpredictable ways, while girls were meticulously groomed for marriage, their worth measured by the awkwardly specific combination of appearance, piety, and ability to sew something without stabbing a finger. Parents often treated adolescence like a countdown timer to usefulness. Once you hit puberty, you were suddenly less of a child and more of a mini-adult, expected to contribute labor, obedience, and occasionally your own marriage prospects, because hey, the family's reputation was more important than your comfort. Sibling dynamics could either be a saving grace or a daily nightmare, depending on whether your older sibling had already been promoted to mini-adult enforcer and decided your mistakes were now their responsibility to report to the parental tribunal. Arranged marriages loomed like medieval horror movies. Teenagers were sometimes betrothed years before they even understood how to hold a conversation with someone of the opposite sex, let alone have a fleeting thought about romantic attraction. Dowries and alliances dictated choices, and personal preference was basically a joke nobody bothered to explain. A girl might be matched with a man she'd never met simply because his family had more goats or land than anyone else in the village, while boys were similarly trapped in contracts they had zero power to negotiate. Daily chores became a ritualized form of endurance, each one reinforcing the lesson that your opinions were irrelevant, your comfort didn't matter, and your existence was a resource to be managed efficiently. Food preparation, laundry, animal care, and tending to siblings or younger relatives consumed hours every day, leaving only brief, exhausting windows of what could loosely be called leisure. Even the small victories, finishing a task without scolding, sneaking a few moments to rest, or outsmarting an older sibling came with the bitter aftertaste of knowing tomorrow would reset the grind. Parents monitored not just physical labor, but moral behavior, dictating how teenagers spoke, who they interacted with, and even what thoughts were acceptable. Piety was enforced with both subtle guilt trips and overt punishment, often administered with a calm ferocity that would make modern motivational speakers weep. Puberty was a double-edged sword. Suddenly everyone demanded more from these bodies that were still awkwardly growing, yet treated mistakes as sins rather than learning experiences. The tension between youthful curiosity and rigid expectation created a constant pressure cooker environment where one misstep, whether spilling ale, forgetting a prayer, or tripping in public, could trigger a cascade of shame that lasted for days. Teenagers were trapped between the impossible demands of survival, labor, and reputation, while simultaneously being pushed toward adulthood before they were physically, mentally, or emotionally prepared. Childhood was abruptly clipped, adolescence barely recognized, and yet society expected them to carry themselves with the dignity and responsibility of someone decades older, making growing up not a gradual process, but a medieval gauntlet of endurance, humiliation, and relentless expectation. Education in medieval Europe was less about inspiration and more about surviving a constant barrage of memorization, corporal punishment, and existential dread disguised as lessons, because apparently teenagers needed daily reminders that life would never cut them slack. Boys destined for trades were handed hammers, chisels, or plowshares before their muscles and coordination were even ready, under masters who treated clumsy attempts as evidence of moral failure rather than growing pains. Every mistake was a spectacle, every failed task an opportunity for public humiliation, because apparently learning was most effective when paired with shame and a lingering sense of inadequacy. Girls who had the rare privilege of schooling were usually taught domestic skills like spinning, sewing, and cooking to perfection, all under the watchful eyes of mothers, aunts, or older women who seemed to delight in cataloging each minor slip as if each dropped stitch were a personal indictment of the teenager's soul. Even basic literacy was a privilege. Latin, prayers, and rote memorization of religious texts dominated any curriculum, leaving little room for creativity, curiosity, or actual enjoyment. Apprenticeships, the medieval version of career paths, were brutal and often terrifying. Teenagers worked from sunrise to sunset under harsh oversight, learning not just the trade itself but also patience, humility, and a startling tolerance for abuse. Wounds from tools were common, exhaustion was permanent, and the psychological toll of constant evaluation by masters, peers, and the ever-present community was enormous. On the rare occasions when mistakes could not be publicly punished, private reprimands were delivered with a sort of slow-burn judgment that lingered in the mind far longer than any physical pain. Education was never optional. Every lesson, chore, or trial reinforced the idea that their worth was measured in utility, obedience, and ability to absorb criticism without flinching. Even social learning came with pressure. Teenagers had to navigate hierarchical relationships with older apprentices, masters, and patrons while keeping an eye on rivals who might leap at any opportunity to advance by exposing someone else's failures. Meals, when taken during work, were rushed, minimal, and rarely nourishing, making concentration on learning even harder. Yet no excuse was tolerated. Humor, curiosity, or experimentation often attracted scorn because teenage behavior was interpreted as laziness or rebellion rather than the normal chaos of growing minds. Girls faced a double bind, needing to balance skill acquisition with maintaining modesty and decorum, while boys were expected to demonstrate strength, endurance, and competence as if physical capability equaled moral virtue. Community observation was constant. Everyone, from neighbors to visiting clergy, could weigh in on progress or failure, turning education into a public performance of competence and humility. By the time a teenager had survived a single day of instruction, labor, and oversight, their body and mind were taxed beyond what modern humans could comprehend, and yet the expectation to continue performing perfectly the next day remained unchanged. Survival, skill acquisition, and social navigation were tangled into a relentless routine where failure wasn't just disappointing, it could be life-altering. The medieval teenager's classroom, workshop, or kitchen was a gauntlet that prepared them for adulthood, not by teaching wisdom, but by hammering endurance, shame, tolerance, and the stubborn ability to keep going while constantly second-guessing every move. Teenagers in medieval Europe quickly discovered that surviving labor and lessons was only half the battle. The other half was navigating a social battlefield where peers were both allies and merciless tormentors, and sometimes the line between friend and enemy was thinner than a badly stitched tunic. Status within the group mattered in ways that could feel absurdly arbitrary. Strength, skill, family reputation, or even how fast someone could run from a cartwheel accident determined whether you were a respected member of the pack or a walking target for ridicule. Older apprentices and siblings often assumed the role of unofficial referees, doling out punishments, pranks, or public mockery for mistakes that could have been innocent, turning everyday interactions into a tense chess game where one misstep could be fatal to your reputation. Festivals or market days, which might seem like relief, doubled as stages for comparison. Who had the cleanest tunic, who could recite prayers fastest, or whose family had the shiniest goods were measured and judged constantly, creating a persistent anxiety that hovered over teenagers like a shadow they couldn't shake. Physical bullying was common, often disguised as play or initiation, leaving bruises and scars as permanent reminders of social order, while gossip and rumor-mongering acted as invisible weapons that could ruin days, weeks, or even future prospects. Even minor successes could provoke envy, prompting peers to sabotage or mock the achievement as though happiness itself were a crime. Hierarchies were fluid, yet rigid at the same time. A teen could rise in esteem one day for helping with chores, showing strength, or reciting scripture correctly, only to fall the next because someone spotted a crooked shoe or a clumsy gesture. Emotional stress was compounded by constant observation from adults who were ready to interpret peer disputes as moral failings or laziness. So teenagers learned early that complaining was futile and resilience was mandatory. Humor, curiosity, or any attempt at individuality risked alienation, forcing conformity or quiet rebellion carried out in whispers and fleeting gestures. Family reputation amplified peer pressure, as the standing of parents or older siblings often dictated whether a teenager received protection, admiration, or outright scorn, embedding a sense of inherited responsibility that modern teenagers would barely recognize. And while today adolescence is often framed as exploration or self-discovery, medieval teens had no such luxury. Their social landscape was a minefield where every laugh, stumble, and glance carried consequences. Loneliness, anxiety, and the quiet terror of social missteps became invisible companions, shaping personality, alliances, and survival strategies with relentless precision. Even moments of apparent camaraderie were tinged with suspicion. Who would rat you out? Who would mock you behind your back? And who would seize an opportunity to elevate themselves at your expense? Over time, these pressures molded teenagers into masters of reading subtle cues, concealing weaknesses, and negotiating friendships under unspoken rules that were anything but fair. By the end of each day, navigating peer hierarchies, managing envy, enduring ridicule, and avoiding physical harm left teenagers exhausted, wary, and often bitter, laying bare the emotional toll of growing up in a society where survival depended as much on social cunning as on strength or skill. Health and hygiene were basically a medieval teenager's personal horror show, and surviving the daily grind often depended less on strength and more on sheer dumb luck, which honestly makes you wonder how anyone made it to adulthood. Baths were rare, rivers were often contaminated, and lice seemed to treat teenagers like all-you-can-eat buffets, leaving them itching in ways that modern humans would consider torture. Open sewers ran through villages, spreading disease like it was a competitive sport, and the smell, oh, the smell, was a constant companion, clinging to clothing and skin as if the universe itself wanted to humiliate them. Minor cuts could fester into deadly infections, and simple illnesses like fevers or coughs were terrifying because medicine was a combination of guesswork, superstition, and herbs that may or may not have been sprinkled with good intentions. Leeching, poultices, and healing charms were routine remedies, meaning teenagers often endured treatments that hurt more than the problem itself, while being lectured on morality and cleanliness as if suffering for hours was character building. Malnutrition added another layer. Bread, soup, and occasional vegetables rarely provided enough sustenance, so teens were often weak, dizzy, or prone to collapsing after minimal exertion, yet were still expected to labor from sunrise to sunset. Seasonal shortages meant starvation was a real threat, and families' ability to produce or purchase food dictated not just survival, but social standing, putting teenagers on the front line of the struggle for basic nourishment. Mental health, of course, didn't get a single mention. Worry, anxiety, and despair were private luxuries nobody could afford, so teens silently carried the emotional weight of constant vigilance over their own health and that of younger siblings or family members. Epidemics swept through villages unpredictably, taking the unlucky and leaving teenagers to witness death with an alarming frequency, a kind of grim education in the impermanence of life and the cruelty of circumstance. Even small injuries could result in permanent disability, especially for boys in apprenticeships or labor, and yet no time was given for recovery. The world demanded productivity over survival. Girls faced additional hazards, including pregnancy and the threat of complications during childbirth at shockingly young ages, often leaving them with lifelong consequences for which they had zero preparation. Hygiene was impossible to maintain. Clothing rarely washed, hair uncombed, and no way to prevent the constant influx of parasites that treated bodies like open playgrounds. Emotional resilience was tested daily, as every cough, rash, or bruise could trigger fear, scolding, or gossip, layering shame and anxiety on top of already exhausted bodies. Essentially, medieval teenagers lived in a non-stop loop of bodily betrayal, environmental cruelty, and medical incompetence, and yet somehow they were expected to smile, obey, and contribute like nothing was wrong. The constant pressure to stay alive, healthy, and socially acceptable created a tense, exhausting existence where survival required more cunning, luck, and patience than any modern human could imagine. And even then, the odds were rarely in their favor. Growing up in medieval Europe meant embracing the bitter reality that your body was a battlefield, your health a precarious gift, and every day was a gamble with stakes that were, literally, life or death. Work for medieval teenagers was less learning responsibility and more participating in a daily endurance contest with zero applause. And somehow, the adults expected them to grunt and smile like everything was perfectly normal. Boys hauled sacks, carried water, chopped wood, and dragged animals across muddy fields before their bones had finished growing, while girls spent hours bent over looms, tending fires, cleaning floors, and preparing meals that often left them just as hungry as when they started, because medieval cooking wasn't about flavor, it was about survival and impressing relatives who could detect a burned crust from a mile away. Apprenticeships were particularly brutal. Every task was a test of strength, patience, and pain tolerance, and mistakes were punished in ways that would make a modern HR department weep. Long days blurred together under the sun and rain, with no breaks, no complaints allowed, and no understanding that teenagers might, just maybe, be awkwardly growing humans rather than miniature labor machines. The physicality of daily chores left muscles screaming and backs aching, and minor injuries were common, yet teenagers were expected to continue as though nothing had happened, because apparently resilience meant ignoring agony while the world watched. Farming teenagers endured blisters, cuts, and exposure to weather that ranged from scorching heat to freezing cold, often while trying not to let livestock trample them, or worse, fall into mud or river crossings that seemed designed to test the limits of human coordination. Girls' labor, while less obviously violent, was equally exhausting, involving repetitive motions that caused long-term pain and exhaustion, all under scrutiny to ensure every stitch, pot, or scrub met impossible standards. Even play doubled as labor. Fetching water, gathering firewood, or running errands disguised itself as a chance for fun. But teenagers quickly learned that any slip-up meant scolding, punishment, or social embarrassment. Work didn't stop at the household or workshop. Teenagers were expected to help in fields, markets, and even during family obligations, which meant their free time, what little existed, was a mirage, as unreliable as medieval bread. Mistakes weren't just frowned upon, they could have cascading consequences. Spilled milk, broken tools, or a crooked stitch might ruin meals, anger masters, or reflect poorly on the entire family, teaching teenagers that every movement carried unspoken responsibility. Fatigue became a constant companion. Sleep was a brief relief in hard stone beds, and yet the expectation to perform perfectly and continuously never abated. Over time, repetitive labor left teenagers lean, strong, and emotionally brittle, with an intimate knowledge of exhaustion and humiliation that modern humans would call traumatic. Their world measured value in productivity, strength, and obedience, creating a relentless cycle where failure was public, punishment was guaranteed, and survival required a mix of cunning, stubbornness, and grim endurance. In essence, teenage life in medieval Europe was a never-ending gauntlet of sweat, bruises, and relentless expectation, where growing bodies were exploited, mistakes were punished, and even minor achievements felt hollow next to the crushing demands of work that never ended. The combination of physical strain, social pressure, and constant observation ensured that adolescence was a period defined by endurance far more than by curiosity, learning, or enjoyment, preparing teenagers for a world that valued survival above all else. Religion in medieval Europe was less a source of comfort and more an omnipresent referee with a cruel sense of humor, and for teenagers it added an extra layer of psychological endurance to their already exhausting lives. Every cough, sneeze, or misstep could be interpreted as sin or laziness, leaving them walking through life with a permanent sense of guilt, as if simply existing required confession. Church attendance was mandatory, sermons were long, and priests had an uncanny talent for making teenagers feel like their every thought, yes, even that fleeting, ugh, do I really have to? Moment, was morally bankrupt. Superstition threaded through daily existence like an invisible whip. Unlucky colors, improperly swept floors, or a glance at the wrong shadow could trigger whispered warnings from neighbors or relatives, amplifying the already heavy pressure to perform flawlessly in every chore, prayer, and social interaction. Failing to adhere strictly to religious or superstitious expectations wasn't just embarrassing, it could damage family reputation, reduce marriage prospects, or even provoke physical punishment, teaching teenagers that morality was both public and unforgiving. Pilgrimages, fasts, and religious festivals imposed additional physical and emotional burdens, requiring teens to spend days walking long distances, denying themselves food, or enduring rituals that seemed designed to test endurance more than faith. Moral education was constant, delivered through lectures, threats, and anecdotes of divine wrath, ensuring that guilt was a daily companion that never let them forget they were both growing bodies and inherently sinful creatures. Even small acts of curiosity or humor could be interpreted as pride or disrespect, and teenagers learned early that internal rebellion was safer than external expression, although it came with its own anxiety and emotional toll. Folklore and superstition intersected with religion to create a world filled with invisible dangers. Spirits, curses, and divine punishment were ever-present threats that demanded vigilance, while adults enforced compliance with the intensity of an army general inspecting soldiers before battle. Decisions as mundane as how to cut wood or carry water carried moral weight because failure could suggest laziness, sloth, or even divine disfavor, which teenagers internalized in ways that made ordinary tasks feel like trials of virtue. Girls in particular were monitored for modesty, chastity, and piety, and even minor breaches of conduct could be exaggerated into lifelong warnings, making social interactions with peers a high-stakes game of etiquette and secrecy. Boys faced similar pressures, expected to demonstrate courage, loyalty, and moral uprightness while balancing the physical exhaustion of labor and apprenticeships. Fear, guilt, and anxiety were constant companions, shaping decision-making, speech, and even posture, creating an environment where adolescence was as much about surviving spiritually as it was physically or socially. Religion, superstition, and moral oversight wrapped teenagers in a relentless psychological pressure cooker, one where fear of divine wrath blended seamlessly with peer scrutiny, labor expectations, and family demands, ensuring that growing up was never simply about awkwardness. It was a daily endurance test in morality, fear, and obedience, leaving teens exhausted, anxious, and painfully aware that nothing about their life was truly their own. Punishments in medieval Europe were basically designed to make teenagers rethink every single choice they had ever made, and sometimes even the ones they hadn't, because in that world, ignorance was rarely an excuse. Missteps, spilled milk, crooked stitches, incomplete chores, or even a glance deemed inappropriate could trigger scolding, physical discipline, or public shaming that lingered like a stain on reputation. Corporal punishment was standard. Flogging, slaps, or beatings with tools that were conveniently nearby ensured that teenagers learned very quickly the price of incompetence. Apprentices were particularly exposed, punished in front of peers to maximize humiliation while reinforcing the authority of masters, and sometimes older siblings or neighbors would join in the scrutiny because apparently there was no limit to the sources of judgment. Courts, local lords, and religious authorities also held sway, meaning that even small infractions could escalate if noticed, and teenagers became acutely aware that their actions had to be carefully calculated or risk disproportionate consequences. Shame was weaponized. Public ridicule, ridicule songs, and nicknames that stuck for years acted as psychological scars that teenagers carried alongside physical bruises, cementing the lesson that life didn't forgive mistakes lightly. Even seemingly trivial errors could have cascading effects. A failed task could trigger anger from adults, gossip among peers, and a lingering social stigma that affected everything from friendships to marriage prospects. Punishments weren't just about correcting behavior. They were about establishing dominance, social order, and a constant fear that ensured compliance, because medieval society ran on intimidation as much as labor or piety. Teenagers quickly internalized these pressures, walking on eggshells in every environment, second-guessing gestures, words, and expressions, and developing survival strategies that balanced obedience with subtle rebellion, often hidden behind quiet sarcasm or strategic silence. Corporal punishment blended with moral lectures, turning every reprimand into an immersive guilt and pain experience that would haunt their memories for years, leaving a permanent sense of inadequacy regardless of actual skill or effort. Work and chores were extensions of this punishment culture. Failing at a task wasn't just inconvenient, it was evidence of moral and personal failing, ensuring that teenagers constantly monitored themselves under the invisible gaze of parents, masters, and peers. Festivals or communal gatherings offered little relief. Any misstep could be amplified, as public spaces were stages for judgment, laughter, and shaming that sometimes lasted far longer than the offense itself. The combination of physical, social, and psychological punishments created an environment where teenagers learned resilience, caution, and cruelty early, but also a simmering sense of injustice that simmered beneath obedience. Mistakes weren't just corrected, they were memorialized in gossip, reputation, and long-lasting humiliation, which made growing up feel like a public endurance test rather than a developmental stage. Adolescence became synonymous with constant vigilance. Every movement, word, and glance was weighed against an invisible scale of judgment that could tip catastrophically at any moment, ensuring that life was a high-stakes performance with permanent consequences for failure. Survival, in this sense, wasn't about strength or knowledge. It was about mastering fear, shame, and the relentless scrutiny of everyone who thought they had a right to supervise your existence. Leisure for medieval teenagers was less fun and more a risky negotiation with fate, because even rare moments of enjoyment came with the constant threat of chores, moral judgment, or ridicule hovering like a dark cloud. Games existed, of course, but they were rough, often dangerous, and rarely private. Stick fights, mock sword duels, and wrestling matches doubled as skill training or social testing, meaning that a scraped knee could lead to scolding from adults or teasing from peers for days. Storytelling, when permitted, was usually dominated by adults who turned every tale into a cautionary lecture about virtue, obedience, or piety, leaving teenagers craving a narrative where they weren't always the cautionary tale. Music, singing, and dancing were sometimes allowed during festivals or work breaks, but these moments were fleeting, socially constrained, and often under the critical eye of elders who could instantly ruin the experience with a disapproving glare or sharp comment. Even eating, which might seem mundane, offered tiny pockets of pleasure, though hunger often interfered, and any act of indulgence could provoke guilt, moral scolding, or suspicion that the teen was being lazy or selfish. Hiding, wandering, or exploring unsupervised spaces was another form of rebellious entertainment, but it came with the constant awareness that discovery could trigger punishment, gossip, or public embarrassment, which made the act both exhilarating and exhausting. Friendships offered brief reprieves from the relentless pressures of labor, religion, and social hierarchy. Yet even these bonds were complicated. Teasing, rivalry, and constant comparison ensured that trust had to be cautiously extended, and moments of joy were frequently interrupted by practical concerns or moral policing. Humor, sarcasm, and minor mischief became survival tools. Laughter was stolen quietly or shared in whispers because overt fun risked punishment, social damage, or moral judgment. Seasonal changes dictated activity. Summers allowed slightly more freedom for swimming, foraging, or climbing trees, while winters restricted movement, increased labor, and intensified the physical discomfort of daily life. Crafts, hobbies, or personal interests were limited and always judged on utility. A teenager who showed skill in music or art might be encouraged only if it contributed to family prestige, social standing, or religious devotion. Otherwise, it was dismissed as frivolous. Animals could provide companionship or amusement, but caring for them doubled as labor, so joy was always intertwined with responsibility, guilt, or exhaustion. Even moments of intimacy, secret glances, whispered conversations, or fleeting crushes were fraught with risk, as any hint of romantic interest could trigger gossip, moral admonishment, or parental intervention. In essence, leisure existed only as a thin veneer atop relentless labor, social scrutiny, and moral pressure, making enjoyment temporary, secretive, and mentally taxing. Teenagers learned to savor micro moments, celebrate small victories, and develop a private inner life that could resist external pressures, because without these tiny escapes, the weight of work, fear, and expectation would have crushed them entirely. These rare moments of freedom were both precious and precarious, highlighting how adolescence in medieval Europe was a constant balancing act between survival and fleeting pleasure, where even fun demanded strategy, patience, and a keen sense of timing. By the time medieval teenagers reached what adults considered full maturity, their bodies, minds, and spirits had already been through enough to make modern adolescence look like a spa retreat, and the transition to adult life was less a rite of passage and more a barely survived gauntlet with zero fanfare. Those who survived labor, disease, social scrutiny, moral policing, and relentless punishment carried with them scars both visible and invisible, their posture often stiff from hours of hard work, hands rough and blistered, and brains trained to anticipate criticism at every glance or misstep. Family expectations continued to dominate, with marriages, apprenticeships, and household responsibilities cementing the sense that personal choice had always been a luxury reserved for the wealthy, leaving most teenagers realizing that independence was a myth carefully disguised by adulthood. Social skills were honed out of necessity rather than curiosity. Navigating gossip, hierarchy, and peer rivalry had equipped them to read subtle cues, avoid confrontation, and maintain appearances even when internally exhausted, which was less wisdom and more survival instinct coded by years of public humiliation and constant judgment. Their sense of morality, heavily influenced by religion and superstition, often coexisted uneasily with practical survival, creating adults who were simultaneously cautious, anxious, and suspicious of their own impulses, traits that modern psychologists might call trauma-adjacent, but medieval society just called character building. Health issues accumulated, untreated injuries, malnutrition, and disease left lingering consequences, while mental fatigue from years of vigilance, fear, and relentless labor meant that even small joys, as adults, could trigger a surprisingly strong sense of guilt or anxiety. Teenage experiences had trained them to endure, suppress, and strategize, but at the cost of spontaneity, carefree curiosity, and the luxury of naivety. Humor became a private coping mechanism, sarcasm a shield, and inner commentary a constant companion. Economically and socially, few teens experienced upward mobility, so survival was a lifelong skill, learned early and polished painfully. A teenager who had mastered obedience, labor, and social navigation often became an adult who could function, yes, but never fully forget the toll exacted by those formative years. And yet, despite all the exhaustion, humiliation, and fear, medieval teenagers had also developed resilience that was invisible to outsiders, a stubborn endurance that allowed them to survive plague, famine, and harsh labor, a strategic mind capable of reading others like a medieval version of a poker game, and a quiet defiance that let small joys exist even in the harshest circumstances. Growing up in medieval Europe left a permanent imprint, shaping identity, behavior, and relationships long after childhood ended, and the shadow of teenage life lingered in subtle ways, a constant reminder that adolescence had never been innocent, easy, or kind. It was brutal, relentless, and unforgiving, but it produced survivors, people who could endure more than their bodies or minds should reasonably allow, armed with skills and patience, cunning, and resilience, even if modern society might consider some of their coping mechanisms slightly unhealthy. Ultimately, medieval teenage life was a masterclass in survival, disguised as coming of age, where every day tested endurance, morality, and social awareness, leaving teenagers ready for adulthood in body, mind, and strategy, but rarely in spirit, and certainly never without a lifetime of scars and sarcastic internal commentary to prove it. Kings learned very early that banquets were not about relaxation. They were about survival with cutlery. In medieval courts, long tables glittered with silver, candles flickered, musicians played something vaguely cheerful, and somewhere in the hall, a man considered whether tonight was the night he would become the guy who tried it. Assassination attempts often began not on battlefields, but between courses of roasted swan and watered wine. The logic was almost funny. A king had to eat. A king had to appear in public. A king had to trust someone to taste the soup first. That thin chain of necessity became the weak point in the entire divine right of kings thing. Poison slid quietly into goblets. Daggers hid inside sleeves that had been tailored just a bit too wide. In 1400, King Henry IV of England reportedly survived plots where servants were bribed and food was suspected. Earlier still, in Scotland, King James I had been hunted through the corridors of a monastery in 1437 after conspirators burst in with drawn blades. He had once blocked up a sewer exit to prevent tennis balls from escaping. That sealed tunnel became the reason he could not escape. History sometimes felt like it was written by ironic screenwriters. Banquet halls, meanwhile, were architectural nightmares for security. Multiple entrances, torchlight shadows, nobles armed, because everyone was always armed. The king sat elevated, sure, but elevation just made him visible, a human centerpiece. Chroniclers describe moments when a sudden shout caused hands to fly to sword hilts faster than any modern security drill. Suspicion flavored every dish. Even loyalty felt conditional. Nobles swore fealty in the morning and weighed alternatives by evening. The atmosphere must have been exhausting. Imagine trying to enjoy your pudding while wondering if your cousin had finally snapped. Yet kings kept hosting feasts because power required spectacle. They needed witnesses to their magnificence. They needed applause. That need created opportunity. Over centuries, plots rose and collapsed like badly baked soufflés. Some were betrayed in whispers before dessert. Others exploded into violence so quickly that tapestries were slashed and goblets overturned mid-toast. The absurdity was almost theatrical. Velvet, gold, and sudden stabbing. Divine appointment met very human resentment. And so the pattern began. Crown, banquet, conspiracy, repeating with small variations, like a grim lullaby that courts across Europe learned by heart. Rulers smiled for their guests, nodded at jokes, and pretended not to notice which eyes avoided theirs. Every raised cup might have been a blessing, or it might have been the last thing they ever lifted. By the early 17th century, subtle daggers began to feel almost old-fashioned. If one were going to remove a king, why not attempt something louder, something that shook the walls and rewrote the skyline? That was roughly the energy simmering beneath England in 1605, when a circle of Catholic conspirators decided that blowing up Parliament might solve several political inconveniences at once. The plan targeted King James I, along with the assembled lords and bishops, a kind of catastrophic group chat deletion in one single explosion. Gunpowder had already transformed warfare. Now it was being repurposed for regime change with dramatic flair. Barrels were stacked beneath the House of Lords like an extremely illegal basement renovation. Letters were sent, coded and cautious, though not cautious enough. One anonymous warning reached Lord Monteagle, who, instead of ignoring it like suspicious spam, handed it to authorities. And just like that, the conspiracy began to wobble. Guy Fawkes, the unfortunate face of the operation, stood guard in the cellar when officials descended in the early hours of November 5th. He had matches in his pocket and calmness that must have been rehearsed. The arrest that followed felt less like a cinematic blaze and more like an awkward interruption. Under torture, details spilled, names followed. The grand design unraveled into court transcripts and executions. What lingered was not only relief, but spectacle. Bonfires lit across England, effigies burned, a yearly reminder that monarchy had dodged a fireball. It was strange how quickly the narrative flipped. The conspirators had imagined themselves as agents of righteous correction. The state framed them as villains in a morality play that repeated every November with fireworks. Irony hovered over the whole episode. The very technology that symbolized modernity, gunpowder, innovation, chemistry, had nearly ended a dynasty in one thunderous instant. Instead, it fortified the crown. Laws tightened. Suspicion toward Catholics hardened into policy. The failed attempt did not merely preserve a king, it reshaped a nation's anxieties. James continued his reign, perhaps glancing more often at basements and cellars than before. One could imagine him stepping into Parliament thereafter with a flicker of private calculation, aware that beneath polished floors, history had nearly detonated. The episode revealed something essential. Assassination attempts were not always intimate. Sometimes they were infrastructural. They required logistics, rental spaces, barrels, timing. And yet, for all the elaborate preparation, the downfall hinged on a single letter and a decision to read it seriously. Power survived by inches. Long before gunpowder plots rattled basements, a single arrow altered the fate of England in 1066, and it did so with the casual indifference of gravity. King Harold Godwinson had just finished defeating a Norwegian invasion in the north when he marched his exhausted army south to meet William of Normandy. The Battle of Hastings unfolded in a blur of shields, mud, and shouting that must have sounded less heroic and more chaotic than later paintings suggested. Harold's forces held the high ground, forming a shield wall that bristled like a stubborn hedgehog. For hours they resisted, then something shifted. According to the Bayeux Tapestry, an arrow struck Harold in the eye. Historians still debate whether that detail was embroidery, literally, but the symbolism stuck. One projectile, one moment of bad luck, and suddenly the Anglo-Saxon king was down. It was not even a theatrical assassination in the banquet sense. It was a battlefield accident that functioned like one. The king's body fell, morale collapsed, and William pressed forward. Leadership in medieval warfare was dangerously visible. Kings wore distinctive armor, banners fluttered above them, and enemies knew exactly whom to aim at. Harold had been both commander and target. When he died, whether by arrow or blade, in the final crush, the structure of resistance snapped. The consequences were immense. William seized the crown and reshaped England's aristocracy, language, architecture, even its legal foundations. Norman French seeped into courtly vocabulary. castles rose across the landscape like stone exclamation points. It was astonishing how fragile continuity proved to be. A kingdom that traced lineage back centuries pivoted because one man did not duck fast enough. The episode illustrated a brutal truth. Assassination attempts did not always require secret meetings or coded letters. Sometimes they required only proximity and physics. On a battlefield, intent blended with opportunity. Thousands shot arrows. Only one needed to land decisively. Chroniclers later elevated Harold's death into legend, perhaps to soften the randomness. People preferred narratives with meaning over those ruled by trajectory, yet the randomness lingered. If the arrow missed, if the shield wall held another hour, if exhaustion had not dulled reflexes, history might have taken an entirely different accent. Instead, England awoke under Norman rule, its future recalibrated by a shaft of wood and iron. Kings thereafter understood that visibility, the very essence of command, was also vulnerability. To be seen was to be aimed at. Roman politics had long perfected the art of smiling while sharpening knives, so when conspirators closed in around Julius Caesar in 44 BCE, it was less a shocking twist and more the inevitable season finale. He had accumulated titles like someone hoarding limited edition collectibles, dictator for life, Pontifex Maximus, general, reformer, and with each new honor, the Senate's collective anxiety ticked upward. Rome had expelled kings centuries earlier. The word itself felt radioactive. Yet Caesar's dominance blurred the old Republican lines. Some senators convinced themselves they were saving liberty. Others likely just resented being sidelined. Idealism and envy mixed. History rarely separated them cleanly. On the Ides of March, Caesar entered the theater of Pompey, perhaps mildly irritated, perhaps distracted. The conspirators clustered with rehearsed casualness. Then steel flashed. They stabbed him 23 times. Ancient sources described chaos, robes tangling, shouts echoing, senators slipping in blood. One detail endured in cultural memory, that he recognized Brutus among his attackers. Whether he actually said anything famous was uncertain, but betrayal made better storytelling than silence. The assassination was intimate, almost claustrophobic. No arrows from afar, no explosives under floors, just colleagues at arm's length. The conspirators imagined Rome would applaud. Instead, the city recoiled. Caesar's funeral ignited public fury. Mark Antony's oration stirred emotion like a masterclass in crowd psychology. The assassins fled. Civil war followed. The republic they claimed to defend unraveled further, paving the way for Augustus and the imperial system. Irony again made itself comfortable. In attempting to prevent monarchy, they accelerated it. The lesson felt painfully consistent. Removing a ruler did not reset the system. It destabilized it. Power abhorred vacuums. It rushed in, reshaped, rebranded. Caesar's death became a template for later plots against emperors, though fewer proved so theatrically consequential. Rome cycled through rulers who watched their inner circles with increasing suspicion. Praetorian guards discovered their leverage. Poison replaced daggers in some cases. Whispers replaced speeches. The empire institutionalized paranoia. One could almost picture future emperors glancing at friendly senators and wondering who had rehearsed their lines. The Ides lingered as a cautionary date, proof that proximity could be fatal. Caesar's body fell beneath a statue of Pompey, his former rival, as if history insisted on layered symbolism. The Republic did not revive. Instead, Rome marched toward autocracy with administrative efficiency. The conspirators had aimed for restoration. They achieved transformation. And the Senate House never quite shook the memory of sandals slipping on marble slick with unintended consequences. By the 19th century, assassination plots acquired a new aesthetic, industrial, ideological, and slightly obsessed with explosives. Russia offered one of the starkest examples. Tsar Alexander II had actually attempted reform. He emancipated the serfs in 1861, tinkered with judicial systems, eased censorship in fits and starts. It was not nothing. Yet reform moved slower than expectation, and expectation had teeth. Revolutionary groups such as Narodnaya Volya, the People's Will, concluded that symbolic violence might jolt the empire awake. They had already tried multiple times to kill him. There had been a shooting attempt in 1866. There had been a bomb placed beneath a railway in 1879. There had even been an explosion under the Winter Palace in 1880 that shook walls, but missed its primary target, because the Tsar's dinner ran late. Timing, once again, behaved like a chaotic character in its own right. By March 1881, the conspirators refined their plan. They knew Alexander's route through St. Petersburg. They prepared hand-thrown bombs, compact and devastating. When the Tsar's carriage rolled along the Catherine Canal, one bomber struck first, damaging the vehicle but not killing the ruler. Here was the almost cinematic twist. Alexander emerged from the carriage to inspect the wounded. It was a gesture that felt human, perhaps compassionate, perhaps impulsive. A second conspirator stepped forward and detonated another device at close range. The explosion mortally wounded the Tsar. Blood-stained snow. Reform ended in fragments. The assassination did not usher in liberal transformation. Instead, it hardened reaction. Alexander III reversed many of his father's reforms, tightened autocracy, strengthened secret police networks. The revolutionaries had aimed to accelerate change. They provoked retrenchment. The pattern repeated with grim consistency. Violence intended as awakening often triggered fear instead. Yet one could not ignore the broader atmosphere. Industrialization had altered cities. Literacy expanded. Ideas circulated faster than ever. Assassination attempts increasingly resembled political manifestos written in gunpowder. They were public statements as much as tactical removals. The Tsar's death echoed across Europe, reinforcing the sense that no monarch, however insulated by palaces and protocol, was unreachable. The tools had become portable. Ideology supplied motivation. Alexander II had survived several close calls before fate converged with opportunity on a cold afternoon. It was unsettling how persistence eroded probability. After enough attempts, statistics began to bend. Guards doubled. Routes varied. Suspicion thickened like winter air. But even layers of security could not neutralize a determined network willing to trade its own survival for a headline. The canal water flowed past the site as if indifferent, carrying away smoke, while the empire braced for a future shaped not by reformist optimism, but by the echo of two explosions. Some rulers developed reputations that bordered on myth, not because they were beloved, but because they simply refused to die on schedule. King Zog Wall of Albania earned that strange distinction in the early 20th century. Before he crowned himself king in 1928, he had already navigated coups, rival factions, and a political culture that treated firearms as conversational punctuation. Albania's interwar years were volatile, stitched together by alliances that shifted like loose floorboards. Zog survived poisoning rumors, blood feuds, and at least one very public shootout on the steps of the Austrian parliament in 1931, where an assassin opened fire while Zog was visiting Vienna. Shots rang out. Zog reportedly drew his own pistol and returned fire. It sounded less like royal protocol and more like an action serial. He escaped unharmed. The image stuck. A monarch ducking bullets, coat flaring, composure somehow intact. Attempts followed him like unwanted fan mail. Political enemies viewed him as authoritarian. Supporters framed him as stabilizing. Either way, he was a target. Security tightened, but unpredictability lingered. Zog cultivated a certain theatrical calm, as though survival were part of his personal brand. One could imagine foreign diplomats observing him with a mix of admiration and disbelief. How many near misses did it take before danger felt routine? There was something almost surreal about a king who seemed statistically overdue for disaster, yet kept walking away. Of course, survival did not equal serenity. Zog ruled in a Europe tilting toward extremism. Italy, under Mussolini, eyed Albania with growing interest. In 1939, Italian forces invaded, and Zog fled into exile. He lost his throne not to a bullet, but to geopolitics. The irony was sharp. After evading assassins, he was undone by invasion. His earlier escapes nonetheless highlighted a shift in the nature of political violence. Assassination attempts were no longer rare ruptures. They were recurring strategies in unstable states. Modern weapons made proximity less necessary, and public appearances carried heightened risk. Zog's continued survival after multiple plots reinforced a paradox. Attempts could weaken a ruler's aura, but surviving them could also amplify it. Each failed effort became a strange endorsement of resilience. Yet beneath that narrative lay exhaustion. Living under constant threat reshaped decision-making. Trust narrowed, routines dissolved, even sleep must have felt conditional. The king, who would not die, eventually lived long enough to see his homeland transformed without him. Survival, it turned out, was not the same as victory. Still, for years, he embodied a stubborn anomaly in the history of assassination attempts, a reminder that sometimes, improbably, the target kept standing while history recalculated its aim. The 19th century drifted into the 20th, with theaters still lit by gaslight and politics staged almost as carefully as plays. In 1865, across the Atlantic, President Abraham Lincoln attended a performance at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., confident enough in the war's near conclusion to indulge in an evening out. Though he was not a king, he embodied executive power in a nation still defining itself, and to his assassin, that symbolism mattered. John Wilkes Booth, an actor who understood stagecraft intimately, moved through familiar corridors with unsettling ease. The setting was almost too perfect. A balcony box, an audience laughing below, the president seated in partial shadow. Booth fired a single shot into the back of Lincoln's head, then leapt to the stage, breaking his leg in the process. He shouted a Latin phrase, or something approximating it, and fled into the night. The scene blended performance and violence so tightly that witnesses struggled to process it. At first, some assumed it was part of the show. Reality clarified itself slowly, like a curtain lifting on tragedy. Lincoln died the next morning. The assassination reshaped Reconstruction, altered political momentum, and deepened national trauma that had barely begun to scab over. Booth imagined himself as a heroic avenger. History remembered him as a cautionary study in delusion. The act demonstrated how public accessibility, handshakes, theater visits, open boxes, created vulnerability in leaders who valued connection. Unlike medieval kings encased in stone castles, modern heads of state navigated crowds. Democracy demanded visibility. Visibility invited risk. Security practices evolved in response, though often reactively. The Secret Service expanded its protective role only later. In the immediate aftermath, grief mingled with fury. Booth was hunted down and killed days later, his conspiracy network dismantled. Yet the structural consequences lingered. Vice President Andrew Johnson assumed the presidency, bringing different priorities and temperament. Policies shifted, tensions hardened. One gunshot had rerouted political development at a fragile moment. The theater itself became memorialized, its balcony preserved like a relic of interrupted continuity. The assassination revealed that even in systems without crowns, leaders occupied symbolic heights. Removing them violently could destabilize trajectories as profoundly as regicide. It also underscored the performative dimension of political violence. Assassins often sought audiences as much as outcomes. Booth's fatal mistake was believing history would applaud. Instead, it recoiled. The echo of that shot traveled far beyond the theater's walls, reverberating through institutions still under construction. In June 1914, Europe stood balanced on a structure that looked solid but felt suspiciously brittle, like a chandelier held together by old wiring and mutual denial. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, heir to a multi-ethnic empire already creaking under nationalist strain, visited Sarajevo with a schedule that underestimated both resentment and bad navigation. His motorcade rolled through streets lined with spectators and conspirators from a Serbian nationalist group known as the Black Hand. Earlier that day, one assassin had thrown a bomb at the Archduke's car. It bounced off the folded roof and exploded beneath the following vehicle. Injuries, confusion, outrage, but not death. The plot seemed to have failed. Franz Ferdinand proceeded to City Hall, visibly irritated, which was understandable. Afterward, against better advice, he insisted on visiting the wounded in hospital. Here, history leaned in. The driver took a wrong turn, stalled while reversing, and in that improbable pause the car stopped directly before Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old conspirator who had earlier assumed his chance was gone. He stepped forward and fired 2 shots. One struck the Archduke, the other hit his wife, Sophie. Both died within the hour. The immediacy was almost absurd. Months of plotting, morning chaos, and then a traffic error delivered the target. The assassination did not simply remove a royal figure, it detonated alliances. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia. Russia mobilized in defense of Serbia. Germany backed Austria-Hungary. France and Britain were drawn in. Within weeks, Europe slid into World War I, a conflict that redrew borders and scarred a generation. Princip likely imagined a localized political shock. Instead, his bullets triggered a chain reaction among powers already primed for confrontation. The event exposed how assassination could serve as catalyst rather than conclusion. The empire Franz Ferdinand would have inherited dissolved by 1918. Monarchies toppled across the continent. The war that followed birthed revolutions, including in Russia, and planted grievances that would later nourish another global conflict, all from a street corner where chance and intent intersected. There was something chilling in that convergence, a failed attempt earlier in the day, a rerouted car, a young man with a pistol and a cause. Assassination attempts had long threatened individual rulers. Here, one succeeded and destabilized an entire international system. The world learned that interconnected alliances could transform a regional crisis into planetary catastrophe. As smoke rose over battlefields in the years that followed, the memory of Sarajevo lingered like a prologue written in gunfire. Kings, emperors, presidents, each carried vulnerability. But in 1914, vulnerability expanded beyond a single body. It reached into treaties, mobilization timetables, and collective fear. One bullet did not just end a life, it ended an era,